Oi, 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 everybody, welcome back to the channel. Of course, unclench your jaw and get some water. Today, we have a very special video. We haven't done one of these in a long time. We're making a tier list. We've wrangled all of the killers in DBD, including the Knight and the Skull Merchant, and we're going to slap them on a tier list based on how I feel about their gameplay at sort of all forms of MMR, all levels of play, and kind of explain my reasoning why. Of course, this is an opinion-based tier list. It's not objectively correct, nor will I ever purport it to be. And all I ask is that you respect my opinion when giving your own. And also, just so you guys know, we are giving our opinions on these killers based on their base kit. We are ignoring add-ons because for some killers, add-ons augment them too far, and for some killers, no, they barely have add-ons at all, it seems like. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. I'm going to start at the S tier. I'm going to start with the Nurse. The Nurse, obviously, it goes without saying, is an incredibly potent killer. If you are a newer killer player and you say, how is the Nurse always S tier? It's because she's really hard to play, but if you can get into understanding her and even having decent muscle memory, I think you perform well as the Nurse 9 times out of 10. Really, in my experience as a mediocre Nurse player, is most of my games go pretty well. Nurse is hard to play against, and the Nurse ranks so highly because the Nurse ignores pallets and ignores walls without much of any inconvenience to them. And the other thing is, like, if a Nurse misses a blink attack to hit you and you make some distance, well, the Nurse catches up pretty quickly as well. And this is really tough to play against at the end of the day. When we see the next killers in the tier list, like the Blight, I think he goes through a really long cooldown time to make up less ground, and he has to play through windows and play around pallets and things like this. And that makes the Blight take a lot more to get just as much as the Nurse gets with, in some cases, less effort. So the Nurse is a very strong killer, takes a lot of skill to play, but will always sort of reign supreme just because they can ignore so much of the game. Moving on to the next part of the tier list, of course, we have the Blight. Now, going back to what we talked about with the Nurse, the Blight is an incredibly strong killer, but the Blight has these rush tokens. They have 5 rush tokens, and with these rush tokens, they can bounce across the map at incredible velocity. The thing here is these rush tokens have a pretty long recharge rate. You have to be sure you don't overuse them. And of course, the Blight can't just go through pallets. They can try to go around certain pallets. They can try to go around certain obstacles, but that's not always the play, as survivors can just vault across pallets and things like that. So the Blight still does have to play around the core mechanics of the game in a way that the Nurse doesn't, which in a lot of ways means that you have to play a much tighter game as the Blight. You have to be a pretty solid M1 killer, or you're going to risk overusing your ability, and you're going to risk the survivors making too much distance while you go into recovery. So there's a really high skill ceiling to play the Blight, and to not overuse or exhaust yourself too much of your ability. But also, there's these high-level techniques like the hug tech, which allows you to bounce into an obstacle, get really up close to it, and then slide around it, giving you incredibly harsh angles that you normally wouldn't be able to hit without using 2 tokens or something of this nature. So the Blight has a lot going for them in their kit. Incredible skill ceiling. You have to understand all of the obstacles on all the different maps, what you can bump off of and what you'll accidentally slide around, and there's a lot to be said about how much work you have to put in to be a phenomenal Blight player. That being said, it does pay off in spades. The ability to move across the map quickly is obviously alone very good, but the ability to down survivors very fast with incredible bump logic, thinking 3-4 steps ahead where you want your rushes to be and ad-libbing on the fly, there's just so much that the Blight has in their kit that makes them really, really fun to play, really, really fun to learn, and in my opinion, very fun to go against, unless they're really, really good, and then you're just sort of dead. And of course, we're going to move on to the next tier, which is the Spirit. I went back and forth on the Spirit. The Spirit has been nerfed over the years, and there has been more counterplay added to the Spirit. If you haven't been here for a while, the Spirit used to be really hard to play against because you couldn't quite tell where they were phasing, when they were phasing. And it made it basically a guessing game of, oh, I hope that I can be on the right side of this pallet when I throw it. But recently, the Spirit's gone through enough nerfs that survivors have caught on a little bit, though there's not many Spirit players anymore. The Spirit's incredibly potent in a 1v1 situation, being able to M1 somebody and then catch up to them with their phasing ability, becoming invisible and just sort of popping up for that second hit, being able to hear survivors and make decisions based on that. The Spirit's incredibly potent in those 1v1 scenarios. But unlike the Blight and unlike the Nurse, the Spirit is really only great at 1v1 scenarios. Being able to split pressure is a little bit tougher because the phase has such a decent cooldown on it, and because the Spirit themselves isn't, incredibly skilled outside of waiting for that phase to come back. So there's a lot to be said about using the phase correctly, using it very efficiently, being able to chew through your 1v1 scenarios and get through chases very quickly to continue pressure on the other team. And of course, being able to kind of pop out of nowhere and things like that. But at the end of the day, if the team is pretty split up and the Spirit has to take one chase at a time and one of those chases lasts a little bit too long, it's very difficult for the Spirit sometimes. So I hesitate to put the Spirit in S tier, but we're going to keep the Spirit in S tier just because I think once you've mastered the Spirit, they are still really, really tough to go against in a 1v1 setting, especially if you understand what survivors are going to do. Survivors may double back through windows, they may slow vault or quietly vault back across pallets or pre-throw pallets. Once you understand these sort of mind games, you get a bead on the survivor you're chasing. It's very easy to end chases very, very quickly. It does require a lot of base M1 killer knowledge and, again, all these mind games, but I think it still pays off in spades pretty well. What do you guys think? Of course, we're going to move into the A tier now, and honestly, I almost put the Spirit in the A tier and put this next killer up into the S tier, and that's Carmina, the Artist. The Artist is an incredibly fun killer to play as, and I love playing against the Artist. I think they're very, very fun to go against. There's a lot of reasons for this, but look, the crows are incredibly powerful. Watching streamers like Carnivorous put in a lot of time and effort to mastering the Artist has really opened my eyes to how strong this killer can be. To be in one chase with one person, M1 them, set up a crow, and then shoot that crow at a gen, and then maybe snipe that person at a distance while you're still in your chase here, or even setting up one crow on one person, one crow on another, and being able to kind of just keep this sort of cross-map influence is incredibly impressive to see, on top of the ability to lock down short loops or things like Shack. However, there is a high skill ceiling to be able to pull this off, and so if you've never really seen or felt like the Artist is really high tier, this may be why. Being able to set up a crow at a loop and understand that the survivor may just leave the loop, you have to kind of zone them into the right directions. To be able to snipe across the map requires a lot of understanding of what survivors may do and incredible observational skills. The Artist is really, really potent, requires a lot of skill and a little bit of luck with regards to where survivors may move and things like that, but I think the Artist is incredibly powerful at keeping a lot of the map very, very busy. And I like the counterplay involved with lockers and flashlights or flashbangs to get rid of the crows. I think there's a lot of fun there that people still don't fully understand even this far after her launch, but I think she deserves to be top, if not the top of the A tier, somewhere in the A tier. Of course, next up we have the Oni. The Oni is one of my favorite killers to play. I just think he's fun, he's cool, his design's cool, his skins are cool. The Oni is awesome. The big problem with the Oni, and why I'm not exactly sure if he should be this high into the A tier, is because he has to earn his ability, much like Plague in a way. The Oni has to get a few hits on survivors with his M1 to be able to start them on their process of bleeding, but also if you get an M1 as the Oni, you get almost half of your ability charged up. So you 2 hits and like 2 blood orbs and you have your ability. The problem with this is survivors play very safe against the Oni, right? If you're a very smart survivor, you understand that maybe you don't loop this pallet 3 times, maybe you loop it twice and you pre-throw so that you can just be on your way without taking a single injury. You don't want to give the Oni your ability, and that makes the Oni's early game a little bit tough. You have to be a very competent M1 killer to be able to get that ability very, very early. But once you get the ability, I think that's where you really see people rush in, and you can really, down 1 or 2 people at a time, injure one person, injure another, get your ability, down another, and I think you can really begin to split that pressure and spread it out, because Oni's movement when he's in his demon dash is much more easy to maneuver with than like Hillbillies, while also still being very powerful, very potent, and requiring like a good amount of skill to get decent flicks around hard obstacles. Knowing where you shouldn't use the ability is also incredibly powerful. I'm not an Oni master, but when I play Oni, most of my matches go my way. The Oni is just really hard to play against and kind of scary in some scenarios. So that being said, I think the Oni definitely deserves to be up in this A tier sort of area. His speed is incredibly lethal. Obviously, one shot downing people, it really puts them in a position to like, do I heal? Do I not heal? Damned if I do, damned if I don't. But I think the Oni is very, very strong. What do you guys think about that one? Next up, we have just a lot of contention. I want to talk about the Knight. I think the Knight does deserve to be up here. Now, I know there's a lot of people like, why is the Knight A tier? People just hold W to counter him. But I think that that's a skill issue. And I know that that's hard to understand. But at the end of the day, playing the Knight comes down to sort of two questions of yourself. One, are you a really good M1 killer? Do you understand mind games? Do you understand where you need to chew pallets and things like that? One of the big benefits of the Knight is having the Carnifex on his side. Being able to understand, okay, this survivor is going to just go ahead and throw this pallet as soon as possible. So I'm going to use Carnifex to chew through it and get my hit just immediately. I think that is really, really potent, very strong. But on top of that, understanding, okay, if I hit the survivor, I see survivors healing under the hook there, I'll send a guard there, continue my chase here, so I'll interrupt their healing. They won't be able to top off fully. I'll finish my chase here because I get that haste bonus. And then once I down this person, I'll send a guard over to interrupt their heal again. These sorts of things make the Knight really, really fun for me, and it becomes this chess match of like sort of me trying to split pressure across an entire team, keep them busy, keep them off gens. Really the best thing survivors can do against the Knight is never ever group up and never put themselves in a position to be grouped up like that. Heal in smart spots, run long distances to be sure you are away from the Knight's ability to heal. And that means the Knights have to play a lot smarter. They have to know when they can slug and then go after someone else, even if that person's maybe across the map. And there's a lot going on here, but unfortunately, because the Knight can be played in just this really boring sort of 3-gen manner, I don't think a lot of people are putting enough time into understanding his kit fully. The whole survivors can just hold W away from the Knight doesn't... that to me shows that I think a lot of killers are not really great at predicting where survivors are going to go, or honestly, they're stretching the Knights to the guards too thin, right? Guards can go 30 meters, but if you're sending a guard after somebody who's too far away, yeah, of course they can W away from that, right? That might mean that you're sending a guard after somebody who is also in the middle of the map versus, you know, okay, I hit you, I see you're running sort of towards this edge where I can kind of zone you, so I'm going to send a guard. Are you going to stay in the zone? I think you're a smart survivor, so you might hold W, so I'm actually going to send the guard out to meet you where you're going, and then pinching him in the next corner because they ran across. I think there's a lot of smart things to do here, and I've gone on a pretty lengthy win streak right now. I think out of, let's see, we have 35 wins in a row right now. So I think total we have about 53. Out of 53 matches, we've lost 1. We've tied 3, and we've won the rest. And that's pretty strong, and I'm not using a bunch of gen kick. I'm using like Ruin and Scourge Hook, and you know, I think there's a lot of strength to the Knight, and I don't think you have to play him in a way that means you just run up to a loop and plop him, and then you just go after the, you know, you just throw a guard down, and then you just double hit, or you get an M1, and then you run to the next loop, and you plop a guard. I think there's so much more interesting to him, but I just don't think people are really thinking about that quite so much right now. So I think he deserves his spot up here in the A tier. I think his ability to split pressure across multiple survivors is really, really strong. I think there will become a time where he gets some changes in terms of counterplay, which might make him more interesting and potentially weaker. I'd be okay with that. I certainly don't think he's at B tier, especially considering Dredge, Doctor, or Leatherface, the other B tier killers. I think he's just a cut above that stuff, especially when played at maximum efficiency. Moving on, we have my next main, the Pyramid Head. Pyramid Head is interesting. I think Pyramid Head might be lower in this A tier rank than I put him, honestly, and I'm not exactly 100% sure on that. The Pyramid Head is very, very strong. He has incredible anti-loop capabilities with his Punishment of the Damned attack, though it does have a moderately short range. It's also an attack that's easy to miss. It's very, very easy to continuously just whiff this attack and never get any downs. We talk a lot about how to play Pyramid Head in my streams on Twitch, but I think there's a lot of interesting things that might be a little scummier as well, right? The ability to put someone in a cage, predict where that cage is, and then tunnel them out of the cage immediately. Because the thing about the Pyramid Head is he can put people in cages instead of hooks. And if you can cage somebody, things like survivor perks like Decisive Strike or Off the Record or Deliverance, they don't work. They simply don't work. And so the ability to find somebody out of the cage and immediately down them and immediately put them on a hook, make him a bit of a monster. And he was designed that way. He was designed to be a bit of a monster. And so that's very tough. I don't think playing him that way is always fun for everybody. And it's certainly like, I think there are more interesting ways to play him, but there was a while where I only played Shadowborn on him. And if you're incredibly efficient with the ability and you really don't mess around too hard, I think he's really, really strong. The anti-loop is good. Being able to send people to cages across the map so that survivors have to run all the way across the map to maybe get the uncage, or saying, you know what, my 3 gens or something like that are right here, so I'm going to actually just hook you right here in this 3 gen, and the next time I down you, then I'll just use the final judgment and we'll just kind of get you out of here, right? I think there's a lot of like really, really good stuff there. He can't pressure multiple people, and he doesn't move particularly fast, and that's why I might put him a little bit lower, is because being able to pressure multiple people very, very quickly is really, really important for this sort of A tier category. What I will say is being able to down somebody, cage them, and then immediately start chase with somebody who's trying to rush out a gen or something like that is very, very potent. It's just very situational, not always something you can control. So I think his anti-loop keeps him up in the A tier, but maybe he deserves to be a bit lower. What do you think here? Of course, that pushes us to Wesker, which is interesting. Wesker is a bit of a contentious killer right now, mostly because the hitboxes seem really weird. Survivors can vault a window, be on the other side of the window, and he still grabs instead of gets the hit. There's some interesting things going on there with like his hit validation that I don't know if it's on purpose or what, but with regards to any of that, realistically, I think Wesker, we're seeing a lot of Wesker techs that are interesting. You know, if you dash and I think flick your mouse, you can end up dashing one direction while looking another direction. And if you grab a survivor, you end up zipping again to the direction you were facing. It's very goofy, right? So I don't know if this is intended, if this will get patched out, but if using these kinds of techniques, there's a very, very high skill ceiling to Wesker. It'd be very easy to accidentally overuse your ability to constantly accidentally bump on walls or tiles like shack or things like that. But if you can get across all of this and really learn how to use his 2-dash system, you can cut off a lot of loops, you can put survivors in precarious situations, and if they get infected, then they have to go spray themselves down, which wastes some survivor time, and things of this nature. So not only do you have speed, you have the ability to dash around obstacles and loops, and you will end up wasting survivor time by getting them infected, which in and of itself is pretty big deal. So I think Wesker definitely deserves to be up here. His ability to split pressure is definitely not as strong as most of the other killers in this list. He's sort of like Pyramid Head in that way, except he's a little fast. So interesting. I might put him a little bit lower, but right now he can be difficult to play against in a lot of scenarios. Up next, we have the Plague. The Plague is an incredibly fun killer that was buffed, feels like not that long ago, but also forever ago, and has just kind of become a monster. The Plague, of course, vomits on people, which gets them infected, and this has one of 2 effects. Either survivors stay infected and eventually become broken so that they can't heal. They're constantly coughing, they're very loud. Or they choose to cleanse, and if they cleanse, they give Adiris, the Plague, the ability to drink her red vomit, and that red vomit does damage. Obviously, she has to go to the fountain that was cleansed at. She has to drink it, which is interesting. You know, in one way, if survivors choose to never cleanse, she becomes an M1 killer, but they're always injured, they're always loud, it's very easy to tell where they are, but you do have to chew through a ton of pallets, which can make her weak at times if survivors are very bold, if they pre-run early with sprint burst and things of that nature, makes them very sort of hard to catch. But a lot of the times, I find that that's really not too big of an issue. So you have to be a very strong M1 killer in a lot of cases, but I find in most matches, one survivor eventually gives in, one survivor eventually caves, and they do cleanse. And of course, the Plague starts every match with 1 red pool. So if you play it very smart, you can get that red pool and get a lot of value, because honestly, the red pool is kind of like a Huntress hatchet, but it's easier to aim, in my opinion. It's not as fast of a projectile, but you can hit multiple people with it in one sweep. There's a lot of things that can come from playing the Plague incredibly efficiently. The ability to split pressure is intrinsically there. If one person who's healthy unhooks somebody who's fully infected, they become infected. She doesn't even need to be around to pressure multiple people. So if you can keep track of people and catch people grouping or things like that, it can become an absolute hell of a match for survivors. I think there's a decent skill ceiling to the Plague. I think a lot of people overcommit to fully infecting somebody on 1 vomit, and I think the play is typically to find 1 or 2 people, infect them as fast as you can, and then or just vomit on them once and then chase them and things like that. Really, you just want to get as many people infected as fast as possible and start pressuring them as fast as you can, and then eventually just get your hook as fast as you can. So Instead of overcommitting to one person, getting one person infected. You really want to spread that out. And if you can do that, I think from there, if you can understand the arcs and the angles of the vomit and things like that, I think the plague just becomes an absolute beast. So I think the plague might actually be a little bit higher than Pyramid Head, if not only for the fact that she has to just chew through a ton of pallets, similar to Oni, before she can really be effective at what she's doing. So next up, we have the Hag, a very contentious killer, especially right now with the Skull Merchant coming out, because the Hag was the original 3-gen killer, if I'm being totally honest with you. The Hag sets these traps down and can teleport to any of those traps that are triggered, and they are triggered when a survivor walks into their radius, which is always an interesting mechanic, and it's always very fun, and it's been augmented a lot by add-ons and things like that, but we are talking Base Kit Hag. Base Kit Hag's interesting because Base Kit Hag is very slow, not meant to just commit to chases in their entirety, but can still shut down loops with the traps if she needs to commit to something, which is always interesting. There's a lot of mind games to be had, and there's counterplay by way of flashlights or survivors snapping traps while she's hooking somebody or something of that nature, but a really good Hag can be very, very scary to go against, especially if you get pulled into their territory. I think there's a lot to be said about how to play a good Hag, and I feel like there are very few good Hags, maybe 2 to 3 of them that really commit to it. But when you master Hag, it pays off in spades, and most people end up just hating her. Hag is a bit of a killer that nobody thinks about until they're in a match with her, and then they're miserable, because she can be very strong if you don't keep your wits about you. So I think the Hag is potent, but because of the flashlights, because of crouching, there are some fairly easy ways to counter the Hag that honestly put her a little bit lower than I maybe would have put her a year or so ago. Next up, we're going to talk about the Huntress, a killer that is incredibly beloved in the community and can be very, very potent. The Huntress is 110% movement speed killer and was the first killer to have a lullaby, which is a 40-meter radius through which you can hear her humming. And obviously she has a 20-meter terror radius. The thing about the Huntress is that she really never gets the ability to fully stealth up or sneak up on somebody or catch people off guard, because that 40-meter hum is just so prominent, which means that she really does have to be played at a medium to long range if she can. Survivors might slip up, they might get close to you, which is always good. There's a high skill ceiling to playing Huntress, being able to understand projectile speed and lead your targets at varying distances, right? If somebody is really close to you versus medium range versus long range, what's the travel time on a hatchet look like, and things like that. Incredibly high skill ceiling, and at the end of the day, only having 5 hatchets, you have to be very efficient as well to play the Huntress at a high level. But if you can, the Huntress can be a monster. The Huntress is because the aim has to be very, very tight. It does become a thing where, at a distance, if you miss 1 or 2 hatchets, you've wasted an incredible amount of time, and maybe that loses you the match just because of how this killer is. So there's a lot of risk in playing the Huntress, and playing a high-level Huntress. If you're having a bad day, your aim is off, it's a tough game for you. So I think there's a lot to be said about the Huntress, having to reload, having to be very efficient with your time, having to be sure you're not overcommitting to chases and things like that, while also having a dearth of map knowledge. Incredibly important, very strong killer. I think low A is actually really apt. Now, we're going to be looking at the twins. The twins are really tough for me. I almost put them in the B tier, but I want to say that a high-level twins player, like Lynxy, or somebody of that nature, can make the twins work. If they're playing to win, I think they can make the twins work. Whether the twins are in a healthy position or not is very, very different. All right, you have Charlotte and you have Victor, and you can control, you can cede your control from Charlotte to Victor. You can run Victor around and have Victor spring onto the backs of survivors, or down them entirely, which is fun. It feels kind of fun. What is really, really rough is that swapping between Victor to Charlotte or Charlotte to Victor has these incredibly lengthy cooldowns or transition periods that sort of makes it feel like the only really efficient way to play as the twins is to slug multiple people or slug one person as Victor and find somebody else and then jump on their back while you hook your Charlotte and try to keep this multi sort of process going. Obviously there's a lot of other ways you can, pounce on somebody as Victor. That person could run into Charlotte, you down them, and then lather, rinse, repeat. But at the end of the day, it feels very slug heavy while also feeling really, really clunky. I think of the Knight's guards, being able to send out a guard and kind of almost instantly transition back to the Knight and then continue my chase with somebody else with a haste bonus. Charlotte feels left behind in time, and it's really unfortunate. But I think still, when played at a very high level with very few mistakes, very few bugs, very few like jank issues and moments, I think the Twins are still very strong. And honestly, I'm still waiting on their rework. I think the Knight is a really good thing to pull from if we want to figure out what the Twins could need. But this is a tough spot to be in. My heart goes out to the Twins players because it feels like this killer was released, there was a lot of hype, and then they were just forgotten, and that's really, really rough. But that being said, I still think if you play them efficiently, they're in the A tier. If you find that you can't make them work, you're like, how are they even in the A tier? I think I would encourage you to go watch Lynxy or other really strong Twins players to see kind of what it means to play Twins at a decent level. But that's where we are for now. Moving on, we're going to be talking about Pinhead in the B tier. The B tier has an interesting set of killers, and normally I felt like the B tier would be more padded out than it is, but it has fewer killers than both A and C tier, which is really interesting. We'll talk about that. But first we have Pinhead. Pinhead is an incredibly fun killer to play. I think there's a lot to him, but what puts him in B tier is there's a lot of skill required for very little payoff. In terms of your ability, being able to use the chain to chain survivors. Smart survivors will understand that they can just like hide under the chain portal, they can zigzag, they can weave, they can dodge it, they can juke it. And if survivors juke that chain that the Cenobite puts out, it makes it hard for him to do much of anything. His ability is ranged, but it's not lethal range. It's not like Huntress or Plague or Trickster where they're taking any damage. Of course, remember, we're talking base kit here. So the big thing that the Pinhead has going for him is the box that people have to go solve, the Lament configuration. Of course, this is sort of like a passive objective for survivors to do to kind of keep them off of generators or pressure them if they choose to ignore it. And that really works to his benefit. But if you do play the Cenobite at a moderate to high skill ceiling, he can be really strong, especially if you understand that at loops you stand in the pallet, you chain them while they're on the outside of the pallet, and you walk around to them. It's like a sort of modified pig dash, a lot more effective. But at the end of the day, because his ability has no lethality and because there is a good potential you will miss it a lot, it means that he's very difficult to play as. And at the end of the day, while yes, one survivor will be running around getting the box every 30 to 45 seconds, you still have to play very efficiently, and without that efficiency, you're going to fall a little bit flat. I almost put him in the A tier, but I'm a little bit hesitant because of the lack of lethality in his ability. But what do you guys think? Of course, next up we have the Deathslinger, a killer that honestly I love playing as the Deathslinger, even though I'm kind of bad at it. I don't practice him the way that I've seen other people practice him, but I've seen other people play him, and he can be absolutely menacing in a lot of areas in a lot of ways if you're not just throwing for good snipes. But I think the Deathslinger is a slower killer for sure, but he already automatically, by his base kit, negates perks like Dead Hard. Getting shot by the harpoon you can't Dead Hard that. It doesn't really work. So there are a lot of fun things that are very, very strong about this killer. Of course, the ability to M1 and then follow up with a shot, reel them back in before they hit a pallet, even at short sort of loops or, even if they're 4 meters ahead, being able to shoot them and reel them in because you normally wouldn't be able to get that M1. I think stuff like that is really, really powerful. Being able to hit through windows, really, really powerful. But the Deathslinger does kind of require one-on-one scenarios. He's still a 1v1 killer and has a lot less split pressure than somebody like the Cenobite does. And that means that he's relegated to being below the Cenobite. High skill ceiling to play the Deathslinger. And if you can hit that skill ceiling, you can be absolutely disastrous for teams and really hard to play against. But very few people hit that skill ceiling. Moving on, we're going to talk about Leatherface a little bit. Leatherface is really good at camping, but we're going to try to talk about all aspects of Leatherface's gameplay and why I'm putting him here in the B tier. Because at the end of the day, if he can down you and put you on a hook, yeah, you're almost guaranteed dead. But if you're a smart enough survivor, it'll be really hard for him to down you. Look, Leatherface has a chainsaw that he can rev, and if he revs it, he can kind of do this chainsaw sweep that can go through multiple survivors. It can chew through a pallet, and he goes a little bit faster than normal and has a nice directional capability to turn. And if he bumps into something, he will tantrum and be stunned in place for a very long duration of time, allowing survivors an incredible amount of distance. So what you'll find is a lot of survivors don't really mess around when it comes to Leatherface. They will loop a tile once or twice, and they will throw the pallet, without getting too greedy, right? Because if the Leatherface is able to fully rev that chainsaw and down you before your next rotation, you're in a tough spot. And also, Leatherface is looped pretty hard around windows. Unless you're bringing perks like Bamboozle or Crowd Control, it's really, really hard to sort of, lock in an area that has a strong window. You kind of have to force survivors to loop it 3 times or take the M1 hit on survivors, which is the smart thing to do a lot of the time. But that also negates your whole insta-down chainsaw and forces you to just M1 and then follow up with them and then M1 again, which in some cases is really, really good. The pressure of the chainsaw is really, really solid. So for a lot of the beginning of a match as a Leatherface, you'll find that you're going to have to chew pallets pretty quickly. You might have to play around windows. Survivors are rarely going to just put themselves out in the open, and that means that you're not going to get as much use out of your ability as you think you will. People are scared enough of it that they are just going to play very safely, and that means that you're going to lose maybe a few gens before you can even get somebody on hook, and that's kind of the average high-level play experience with Bubba, I find. But it obviously depends. And again, if we were just talking about camping, he would be S tier, but unfortunately not quite. So next on, we're moving to Nemesis. Nemesis is a killer that I struggled to put, not a little bit lower, but I think B tier is apt. Look, he has this tentacle that will infect survivors if hit with it. The tentacle is quirky at best. It has a lot of weirdness to it. The hitbox for this tentacle lingers, so you can throw the tentacle out and then slide a little bit and strafe into the survivor and hit them 0.2, 0.3 seconds after it's already released. It's very, very strange. It hits over certain obstacles, doesn't hit over other obstacles. Very strange ability that just seems buggier more than it has intentional programming. But that being said, the hitting survivors, being able to get your infection rate up, if you hit there's tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. If you hit tier 3, you can insta-break pallets very, very quickly with your tentacle instead of having to go through the entire animation and things like that. And that makes the Nemesis incredibly potent, on top of the fact that people need to go find vaccine chests, open the chest, vaccinate, unless they want to take damage from the tentacle in the future. This means that you do have a little bit of build up to the beginning of your match, and if you're not careful, you could waste copious amounts of time trying to unlock your tier 2 very, very quickly or something like that. And you don't want to overplay those scenarios, but if you're a very strong Nemesis, you're very patient, you understand the ability very, very well, you can get to tier 2 very, very quickly and start chewing through most of the pallets on the map, which really just makes survivors really easy to down, because at the end of the day, once they start having to run windows, the Nemesis is very strong against survivors at windows and things like that too. So the zombies are sort of the icing on the cake. The zombies are random, but sometimes they can come in at a pinch and can be pretty strong, but they are RNG if they're in the right place at the right time. But so I think Nemesis, like I said, has a lot of early game build up to kind of reach maximum potency. If survivors want to try to keep him from that, they will. And so I think if he can reach that, he excels. But getting to that point is almost like Oni, but with a lot less payoff at the end. So that's kind of why he's where he is right now. Certainly not a bad killer by any means, but takes a little bit of time and effort. Now, next up, we are going to talk about the Dredge. The Dredge is a very interesting killer that I still love, but I still wish we kind of got a little bit more out of. Very interesting. So the Dredge is an amalgam that can teleport to lockers across the map. If survivors are injured, really passively all of the time, something called Nightfall is building up. And if survivors are injured, and when you're teleporting, this Nightfall builds up faster, and when Nightfall hits, basically the entire map becomes pretty black for survivors, making it hard to figure out where they're headed, where they're moving, and things like that. The idea is to help the Dredge to be able to sneak up on people. It does make him undetectable while Nightfall is up. Sneak up on people, keep them sort of like scattered and scrambled and things like that. So the Dredge has that going for them. It does take a long time to build up, and it doesn't give much besides some undetectable, and the survivors are confident Nightfall isn't really very potent. On top of that, the Dredge does have an anti-loop ability where if he's holding his teleport button, he leaves a sort of remnant behind that he can teleport to, and a lot of people found out that you can leave this remnant at these sort of short junky loops, and if a survivor is looping you, you can teleport back to the remnant and catch them as they are looping an obstacle. And this is really good anti-loop, but this anti-loop is really effective at these sort of like short loop tiles, like I said, junk loops. At bigger loops like the shack or LTs, I would say LTs are actually probably not very strong against the Dredge, but jungle gyms, shack main buildings, things like that, this sort of remnant capability is not super strong, and if you're not careful when using the remnant, survivors will leave the loop and potentially get to safety unless you've zoned them appropriately. So at the end of the day, the Dredge is an M1 killer. The idea of hitting and running is really hard with Boon Circle of Healing and medkits and things like that. So you have to be very efficient, you have to have a game plan, and you have to be pretty good at getting downs in the 1v1 sort of space, being able to play around tiles, especially strong ones. So I think the Dredge lower B is pretty good. Next up we have Doc, which I think I might almost put Doc a little bit higher than Dredge and Nemesis. I don't know, this one's really tough. I think Leatherface maybe needs to swap with Doc. The thing about the Doc is the Doc does have anti-loop. The Doc has his shock therapy, which he charges up, he releases it, and then when it shocks a survivor for 2 seconds, I believe, maybe a little bit less, you guys let me know in the comments, for 2 seconds, that survivor cannot drop a pallet or vault a window or dead hard or click their flashlight. They're basically sort of locked out of some of their interactions, which means, the Doc has a pseudo anti-loop. The thing about using the shock therapy is Doc slows down while he's charging it. So while you're slowing down, you lose a little bit of distance on the survivor, just a teeny bit, and then you have to make that up in the next loop, and then you shock, and then you're slowing down, and then you're making it up. So it means that instead of looping something twice and then eating the pallet, you might loop something 4 times to get a hit. You're looping it more to guarantee the hit, and that is a really difficult trade-off to make. Obviously, there are tons of add-ons to augment the Doc and make a lot of this stuff a little bit easier for him, but we're not really talking about the add-ons. Now, on top of his ability to anti-loop and shut some of that stuff down, you do have the Static Blast, and the Static Blast is something that in the Doc's terror radius, he charges it up and he blasts, and it tears everybody up in madness, while also, revealing their locations. And the madness tier up is what's really, really strong for the Doc, because it forces people to stop what they're doing and snap out of it, for like 12 seconds. I think it takes like 12 seconds. Maybe it's like 8 seconds, but it forces them to stop what they're doing, which at critical moments can be really, really strong. Instead of healing each other, you have to stop and snap out of it. And this can slow the game down in your favor sometimes if you're really efficient in chase. But at the end of the day, because the Doc's anti-loop is not necessarily damage dealing, he kind of ends up in this situation like Pinhead, where he's not really getting as much done, and you have to be really efficient with it. Except there's a skill ceiling. It's a little bit less of a skill ceiling because the aim doesn't have to be quite as precise, and unlike Pinhead's passive is always running, and the Doc needs to have a relative location to the survivors for his passive, and it needs to build up over time. You really don't get value out of his ability 60 seconds into the match necessarily. So there's a lot of give and take to the Doc. He's a very middle of the road killer. Nothing too bad about him, but nothing too strong about him. Now we're going to move to the C tier killers. Despite some of their buffs, and despite how some of them may seem in certain areas, in general, normal, average gameplay that scales up in higher level solo queue type stuff, I think that these killers have a higher propensity to fall flat. Now, can anybody go on incredible kill streaks with some of these killers? Yes, they can, and we'll talk about some of that stuff. But generally speaking, these killers will fall about here for the average person. So let's go ahead and talk about the Wraith. The Wraith is a killer that received buffs a while ago and needed them. A killer that can cloak themselves with their bell and zoom across the map all cloaked, sneak up, and then ambush survivors. Sounds really fun, but that's the entire ability. The ability to split pressure is nearly non-existent, especially with medkits and healing being as potent and fast as it is. So the Wraith really does have to commit to these one-on-one chases and chew a lot of pallets and play around windows very, very effectively. And if you can't do that, that's really, really tough. Obviously, a lot of people bring a lot of perks like Bamboozle, Crowd Control, Brutal, Enduring, Spirit Fury, things like that to try to make this killer seem stronger and feel stronger. And there's a lot of great add-ons that can augment this killer, but at the end of the day, they have to play around every obstacle while also committing to just one chase at a time. If they can get a lot of pallets out of the way very, very quickly, then they can become absolutely absolutely incredibly powerful. But if survivors choose to play around a window while a Wraith is cloaked, the Wraith is going to have a tough time, right? Shack is a good example of this. Of if the Shack's trying to uncloak in the middle of the Shack and you're inside the Shack, vault out, and then he'll vault out, and then you vault back in, or he'll try to body block it. And at that point, you try to run in and you get the vault back out. So Wraith has a tough time playing around some of these stronger windows. It's very, very messy, which is why a lot of them run Bamboozle. But at the end of the day, if you strip away the perks and things like that, this is probably about where he falls. So now, next up, we have Sadako. Sadako might be higher than Wraith in some regards because Sadako has a passive, the Condemned. So Sadako can teleport from TV to TV on the map. When she teleports to a TV, the TV turns off for a duration of time, but also any survivor within a specific radius also gains 1 stack of Condemned, up to 7 for the 7 days until you die. This is a really interesting mechanic. Unfortunately, it's not a very potent mechanic. The idea here, I feel like, was to have survivors go turn the TVs off. If survivors turn the TVs off, Sadako cannot teleport, but the survivors are now holding a tape, and they have to take this tape to a TV across the map and turn it in, or they'll build up their Condemned stacks passively on their own. Now, ideally, this sounded like a really strong effect, but most survivors don't have a real incentive to touch the TVs. The Sadako teleporting is easy to spot and easy to run from pretty early, and Sadako is just a normal movement speed killer, even when cloaked, so there isn't a lot of fear or need to turn the TV off. So at the end of the day, Sadako still does have to, she can teleport, be very mobile around the map, can technically sneak up on people, though they do have a lullaby of sort of stringed instruments that you can hear and you can tell, okay, Sadako's nearby, so I should pre-run, get to a pallet, get to a window, making it very hard to sneak up on people fully. It puts you in a position to have to be a very efficient M1 killer. Hit and run isn't impossible, but if you're really good with teleportation, you might be able to force people to need to get rid of their Condemned stacks, but that's really, really tough to say. It's really, really hard to know how that's going to go for you. Now, of course, if you're here, you may know of One Pump Willie. What an incredible name. One Pump Willie is an incredible streamer who has figured out a build for Sadako with certain add-ons and perks that make Sadako a beast. It's the Condemned strategy where you never hook anybody, you just slug them and force them to heal each other until eventually they're fully condemned, and then you can just kill them out of the game because that's what Condemned does. This strategy, of course, relies on perks and add-ons, and so we're not considering that strategy when we're looking at this tier list, but it's worth mentioning, and it's worth mentioning that maybe that gets patched out sooner rather than later. I don't know, but Sadako at a base level is one of my favorite killers to play. So fun. I love the books. I think the Japanese movie is incredible. Really love this killer, but against really good survivors, they are going to struggle. Next up, we have the Trickster, one of my mains for a long time, and a killer that I used to just absolutely love to play, but unfortunately a killer that is in need of a sort of a bit of an overhaul. The Trickster is, at their core, a killer who throws knives. They throw these little throwing knives, and these throwing knives do damage over time. So not damage over time necessarily, but you have to build up into a laceration. So it takes 7 knives, I believe, maybe 6 knives. It's been a while, but it takes a number of knives to fully lacerate the survivor, and once the survivor is lacerated, they take a health state, and then it takes a number of knives again to down them. This seems like a really easy thing to do if survivors let you get close to them, but if survivors are paying attention, they just run early to shack or to jungle gyms, things with tall walls that would block any of these knives. The thing about the Trickster is as fast as the Huntress, but has to work a lot harder to try to take a health state. With Huntress, right, like with the Huntress or the Plague, if somebody's 12 meters out, you can still get the hit, take 1 health state. But with the Trickster, that window of opportunity where you can see somebody between 2 trees before they get to the next tile and things like that, you might be able to get 2 knives, but then you have to catch all the way up, and the 2 knives they just took might end up decaying before you can get more knives into them, because it does take several knives to fully lacerate a survivor, and then it takes several other knives to down that survivor. And what this means is that in a lot of scenarios, you end up sort of chasing survivors. You commit to them one at a time because he's not good at splitting pressure. Unlike Huntress, who can like hatch at one person and then hatch at somebody else and then commit to this chase or something like that, the Trickster can't. The Trickster has to really put a lot of time into getting a health state down in some cases. And then if they are 1 knife short, or they miss several knives or something like that, and they have to go reload, then that's it. There's nothing there for them. So I think a lot of Survivor players hate playing against the Trickster because they don't run early enough. I hear pretty constantly that Trickster feels OP in certain scenarios, and I'll tell you, the scenarios where the Trickster feels OP is when survivors choose to hide. If a survivor hides and the Trickster can get really close to them, of course the Trickster can take their health states incredibly fast. Just without contest, the Trickster can do incredible things. But if survivors are smart and they run to things like the shack and they keep their distance and they don't allow the killer to get too close to them, the Trickster has a really hard time keeping up, especially playing around shack. They'll get 1-2 knives and then they have to catch up and around the corner, and then 1-2 knives here and then catch up and around the corner, and then 1-2 knives here and then catch up. They don't get the benefit of being like Plague or Huntress, where it's like one good hit and that's it. It is a test of endurance and consistency, and it's very, very difficult because of the pinpoint accuracy required from the knives. This is very, very tough to make the Trickster work. They have to commit to one chase at a time. Splitting pressure is really hard unless camping or something of that nature. So plus the main event. The main event is a potent ability, but it's an ability that once you hit 30 knives on survivors, it unlocks, and it allows you to throw a flurry of knives that do not affect the knives that you have in your pocket or your ammunition. And you throw at a very fast sort of rate, but the problem is you're still slower than survivors when you're throwing, which means you still need to be very close to them, or else they will continue to make distance. If you try to use main event at distance, it's going to be very, very tough. Survivors are going to bob and weave. They're going to hide behind obstacles. It's just going to be very tough to get value out of it. And like I said, it procs every 30 knives. You have to sort of earn it by already doing fairly well, and that's kind of difficult to do. So there's a lot of negatives to the Trickster. Not saying he can't be played very well. He requires a lot of skill, a lot of patience, and oftentimes that is rewarded pretty minimally. So next up, we have the Legion, one of the killers that feels oppressive at a lower MMR and is less than impressive at a higher MMR. So the Legion is an interesting band of characters that can, when in their ability, move pretty quickly and hit survivors and put them automatically into the mending state, requiring that they have to mend out. And so this is an interesting mechanic because you hit one survivor and you can see anyone in your terror radius on killer instinct. You can kind of hear their heartbeats bump up, bump up. And as you hit one survivor and you bolt towards the next survivor in this sort of chain of attacks, you gain more speed as you go. And eventually, if you hit 4 survivors in this sort of chain, you can hit one more time to down somebody. So there's a lot going on here. But the thing here for the Legion is it requires survivors to be grouped up and close together. And the number one thing survivors are going to do is try to split up. When I know that there's a Legion and I see somebody has to mend and I can't even hear the terror radius, I know I need to run to the opposite side of the map just so I don't show up on that terror radius. And then once survivors are split up, they work on separate gens, and you'll see 3 gens go by the time Legion gets their first down, right? Something like that. The Legion, at the end of the day, if people choose to stay injured and they just choose to mend instead of healing all the way up, the Legion does have to play pretty well like an M1 killer, where they just have to go through and break pallets and vault windows and things like that. And that's, again, Spirit, Fury, Bamboozle, things like that are going to really help to buff Legion and make them more viable on top of their already pretty strong add-ons. But at the end of the day, their ability is pretty neutered by survivors who want to split up, and you never really want survivors to split. If they group, they're always going to be in a position to go down a lot quicker. So if you are struggling against the Legion, we have tips on this channel for how to play against Legion, but Legion probably feels oppressive because you feel the need to heal too much, your team's healing too much, they're spending a lot of time in the boon just healing every single time. That might be why you're having a tough time against the Legion. Next up, we have the Clown. The Clown has interesting anti-loop and interesting speed up mechanics, but at the end of the day, the Clown it has a pretty high skill ceiling. You have to be able to think very cerebrally, but at the end of the day, you also most of the time have to play around your pallets. Yes, I have seen the guide that is longer than it needs to be, quite frankly, on how to play the Clown, and I think the Clown's interesting, but I think at the end of the day, the Clown is a killer that the purple bottles are strong, but if survivors camp the pallet, then you have to chew most of the pallets in the game. The idea becomes then, okay, well, I'm going to throw a bottle so that they have to move slower through it while I break the pallet so I can catch up to them. You can use the haste bottles, throw that where the survivor is, throw a purple bottle where you want to push them, and you can kind of make hits happen there, but that requires that you are at kind of junkier loops, it's harder to make that work at Shack and things like that. And more often than not, you just need to get pallets out of the way. Clown is a killer that can commit to one chase at a time, and really can't split pressure very, very well. And so this is kind of why they are where they are. Next, we move up to the Ghostface, one of the most popular killers to ever enter Dead by Daylight, and one of my favorite killers to play. The Ghostface is a stealth killer that is just M1. There's no speed, it is stealth, and of course, you can stalk survivors to expose them, and then get really, really fast downs. The thing about playing as Ghostface is stalking is a little bit difficult sometimes, but also, you want to prime people. You want to stalk them early and stalk them, and then come back to them later, right, when you can catch them off guard. Most survivors will see you when you're stalking them, and they will run away. You don't want to try to catch up to them and M1 them, because you lose all your stalk progress. So the hardest thing about Ghostface is that sort of thing. There's like you have to spend a little bit of your early game sort of getting prepped a little bit. In some cases, you might find somebody early, get a grab or something like that, and put them on the hook, but you still need to earn the stalk progress on other people, and a lot of people will pre-run, and so it makes Ghostface, you have to play the long game on Ghostface. You have to weaken the map and be sure you're not over committing to too many chases, but being able to be revealed and pulled out of your stealth is very, very different as compared to Sadako and Wraith, who do not get pulled out of their stealth. They choose when they're going to be stealthy, so they can play hit and run. They can hit you and then disappear, and you create a sense of paranoia. Ghostface, not quite so able to do that, because survivors have the capability to pull you out of your stealth. It puts them in situations where even if you don't think anyone's around and you're like, okay, I'm going to get somebody, I'm going to stalk them, somebody could be behind you just peeking, and they could be stalking the stalker, right? And it makes it really hard for Ghostface to be effective, and it can ruin a lot of your plays just to have somebody out of a position that you didn't even know was there. There's a pretty high skill ceiling to playing Ghostface, but the reward for that skill ceiling is not as high as you'd like it to be sometimes. Nevertheless, I think he's a very fun killer, and I love playing as him. Next up, we have our beloved demo puppy, right next to the Hillbilly, two of the most beloved killers in the game. And I think part of the reason why they're so beloved is because they're not particularly potent. Let's talk about Demogorgon. Demogorgon's got these portals that he can teleport to after placing them, and the portals don't become visible to survivors until after they've been teleported through. Of course, once they've been teleported through, survivors can cleanse them. That's one part of his ability, but the next part is the shred ability, where the Demogorgon lunges, and it's a really cool animation. It's very sick to see. He can lunge and break pallets, or just lunge and hit survivors. The thing about this ability is it's very similar to the Huntress, where it's kind of like a hatchet. If a survivor's running towards a window, you would want to charge your shred and be like, don't hit that window because I'm going to vault after you. The thing is if you get baited out of it, it's hard to kind of come back from it. If you accidentally miss or you bump into something you didn't intend to bump into, survivors can kind of get away without much of a problem. And unlike a Huntress hatchet, there are, you can't hit over tiles, you can't hit over things, you can't get long distance shots. And so Demo's really relegated to chasing one person at a time. And of course, if you're very good at doing that, then Demo can feel very, very fun and very rewarding. And shout out to Bronx, who is just an incredible Demo player. But Demo is relegated to one chase at a time. That makes it very, very difficult. The ability does allow for some pressure, but only in like these long straightaways, right? Because the Demo, when he lunges, is just like all or nothing, 100% full speed ahead. And that makes it not as useful in a lot of areas. So I love Demo. The portals are interesting, but it's like Sadako's TVs in a way, but it can be completely removed off the map, and then you have to walk all the way over, and then you have to place it back down. It's very, very annoying when it gets cleansed out. So you have to think like 5 steps ahead. But very fun killer. Still love Demo. Next, we have the Hillbilly. I'm putting the Hillbilly very low because the Hillbilly requires an incredible amount of skill to play well at a high level. To play the Hillbilly at a very high level it's a maddening amount of skill. And even then, once you've mastered a lot of the Hillbilly's mechanics, somebody simply pre-throwing a pallet or not getting greedy around a loop just completely neuters the killer's ability, right? On top of the fact that the killer has an overheat mechanic, that means they can't use the chainsaw too much, though they're hardly going to get use out of it most of the time anyway. It just makes for like a lackluster, frustrating experience, because if you didn't know, the Hillbilly, unlike Bubba, charges their chainsaw and they run forward. They just dash, kind of this pseudo straightforward. Within in the first like half second of their ability, they do have the chance or the ability to turn a decent amount, and these are called curves. You can curve the chainsaw, and so around a lot of loops at Shack or Azarov cars and things like that, you can curve around the car and get a really strong hit. But typically you have to be very close to the survivor when you start revving the chainsaw, and you have to hope that the survivor doesn't throw the pallet. You have to, maybe rev the chainsaw, fake it so that the survivor doesn't throw the pallet. They think you're going to lose distance, and then you catch up to them. You start revving it at the other end of the car. Then maybe you get the curve, but I don't know. All of that doesn't matter if the survivor pre-throws the pallet. So at the end of the day, it's just a maddening experience to play Billy while you're trying to get this curve. Your overheat hits. If you are incredibly cracked at Billy and just nuts, you, like I said, are still neutered by somebody pre-throwing a pallet or just playing safely, which, unlike the Blight, is disastrous and frustrating. So I would love to see a world where Billy is better. I just don't know where that world may be out in the universe. So, all right, we're into our D tier now. We are going to be looking at Frederick. Freddy is an incredibly boring killer, one of my least favorite killers to play. He's not weak per se. Actually, I would say that he's almost, in some cases, maybe slightly better than Clown. The thing about Freddy is that Freddy can teleport across the map. He can teleport to generators that are not completed, but this teleportation process has an incredibly lengthy cooldown, meaning that you have to really commit to where you're going on the map, and if you teleport somewhere that has nobody there, then you have to walk all the way across the map. Not the end of the world, but anytime you can teleport anywhere, that's obviously a big boon to you as a killer to be able to get across the map very quickly. But it doesn't really help you when you can only do it to gens that are not completed, because boons and survivors healing and things like that could be near completed gens, and it would be nice if you could go that direction, but you can't. The other thing about Freddy is both in his pools and his pallet placements. The Dream World Freddy can place pools that will slow survivors down if they step through them, or you can place fake pallets. Both of these are not great. You have to be in a very small, specific location to place down the pools or to place down the pallets. Unlike the Clown, who can throw a bottle at a distance and slow survivors down so he can catch up faster, Freddy has to basically catch all the way up to you and then place these pools in front of him, and then maybe get some value out of them unless the survivor pre-throws the pallet or something like that, in which case, happy day. It's a very frustrating set of mechanics that it's a lot of work for very little. I think a lot of survivors end up wasting time, because if you do fall asleep as a survivor, you can choose to go wake up. So I think a lot of survivors waste time by feeling like they need to wake up regularly instead of taking chase against Freddy and just staying asleep and working on gens. But at the end of the day, Freddy just isn't very effective at what he does. It's kind of a war of attrition. Eventually, if you break enough pallets, none of his abilities actually really matter much, because you could just down survivors, and that's interesting. That's worth talking about. Next up, we have the Pig. I love the Pig, and I think seeing what Scorpions can do with the Pig is really, really great. But the Pig, unfortunately, is really, really weak. The stealth slows you down an incredible amount if you choose to do it. Doing a Pig dash out of stealth is actually less effective in a lot of cases when you sneak up than doing an actual M1 attack or going for a grab. On top of that, like the Pig dash, if you use it at pallet loops and things like that, 90% of the time survivors are just going to leave the loop. And so at the end of the day, you're actually crouching to hope they leave the loop so you can catch up by standing back up. And that's really, to me, not the sign of a very strong or efficient ability. Now, that being said, the Pig's head traps are very, very strong and potent if they can get enough of them out very, very quickly. But most survivors, if they loop well enough, they'll keep a Pig from downing them pretty well. And that will really, if 2 or 3 gens are gone by the time you get your first head trap out, it's just going to be a tough game, right? It's going to be a really rough match, and you're going to have to hope that you broke enough pallets along the way to get something done. That's really, really rough. That's a really, really tough time. And that's why, the sort of disparity between Pinhead and the Pig is interesting. Pinhead's box is up passively on a timer, whereas Pig has to earn that first down. And with an ability that does not help you in chase, that's hard to do sometimes. So we're putting the Pig here. There are a lot of things that you can do to augment the Pig dash or make the head traps quite a bit stronger. There's all kinds of add-ons for that stuff. But right now, when we're just talking about base kit, I think this is where the Pig is right now. Now, next up, I know you guys waited. This is the Skull Merchant. Now, there is a lot of talk going on right now about how the Skull Merchant can drag on matches with 3-gen strategies and things like that for copious amounts of time. That's a really tough spot, and I'm going to monitor that, because maybe that 3-gen strategy, while it's a deeply unsavory and unfun strategy for literally everybody, that may put her slightly higher in the rankings. But if we're just looking at the Skull Merchant as somebody who chases, not doing a lot, right? The idea for the Skull Merchant is to walk into a loop and place down one of the drones to potentially expose a survivor who you're looping. If that survivor stays within the radius of that drone, they become exposed after 10 seconds. The interesting thing about that is most survivors that are healthy will just leave the loop entirely. Survivors would rather take an M1 and use their speed boost to run away than stay and get insta-downed. Now, once a survivor has forced you to M1 them, and they leave that loop, they are going to run to the next loop. You'll throw up a drone, but now the exposed doesn't matter so much because they're already injured. So the drone grants the killer obviously undetectable if you are within the radius, but at things like Shack, that doesn't really matter much. Survivors can wait at a pretty strong corner. They can see you coming through the window. They can know where they need to be. It doesn't really work super well. And then at like junk loops, survivors can just see you. They can just lay eyes on you. So there might be talks about strategies of placing your 4 drones in sort of a interesting path or webs that you say undetectable for long periods of time as you move through the map. But at the end of the day, this is stealth that is far less effective than Wraith or Onryo, less effective than Ghostface's stealth, which is interesting because it's not really stealth per se. You have to be inside of these giant orange circles to become stealthy, and these circles give away your position intrinsically. So it's very interesting. Obviously, this killer can do very well at sort of gen defending, putting a drone up over a gen. If a survivor comes up and hacks that drone, then they get a claw trap tracker on them that shows where they are. And that is not that strong, but like I said, going back to the 3-gen strategy, if the killer continuously uses certain perks and throws up drones and kicks gens, and they can war of attrition you to death, and that can make playing against her a slog. But I don't think she's intrinsically strong. I think this has a lot more to do with perks and a lot more to do with play styles than anything else. And so, yeah, I don't know. The Skull Merchant's not particularly good at anything except 3-genning, it seems like, and I think that is more than worthy of the D tier slot. Next up, we have the Trapper. Really one of my favorite killers to play in the game, but just such a slog to play as sometimes, right? The thing about the Trapper, original killer, you can place down a trap, and survivors step into the trap. They're immobilized until they either free themselves, which is a little bit of RNG, or somebody else frees them. The problem with Trapper traps is the Trapper has to walk over, pick up a trap, set it down, walk somewhere else, set down a trap. If their Trapper bag is empty, they need to go find more traps, pick them up, set them down. It's a whole lot of work to set up this sort of web of traps, right? And if we look at the Skull Merchant walks up and goes, "Waha," and that's it. The thing is there. The Trapper has to go find his ability across the map, pick it up, put it down. Very strange. Now, what the Trapper has that the Skull Merchant doesn't have is actual lethality, right? If you are chasing a survivor and they are zoned into a corner, you can place down a trap at a pallet, and even if that survivor's injured, they go, "Well, I can't play around that thing," and they have to try to leave, and then you could try to get the M1, try to get the down. Unlike the Skull Merchant, the Trapper actually has this going for them. But the problem with the Trapper is that if somebody gets a little bit curious and chooses to run the map and just snap your traps that you've set up at different loops and tiles, you have to walk back to them, pick them up, and set them back down. There's no penalty for snapping the traps. There's no reason not to. It doesn't hurt the survivors. It just takes a little bit of the time. It doesn't injure them. They don't have to make any judgment calls on whether they want to snap the traps or not. They just can. And sometimes they do for fun. Well, take that, Trapper man. And that's really, really tough to deal with. So at the end of the day, the Skull Merchant has this thing that, when you set up a drone, there's a 10-second invulnerability period where it cannot be taken down, and then if somebody does hack it after that 10-second undetectable period or untouchable period, even if they do hack the drone, there's a tracker on them. There's like kind of a downside, right? It's not much of a downside, but it's kind of a downside. She has more in her kit than Trapper. Trapper just has a little bit more lethality if he can put you in a corner or in certain negative spots, right? Or if he can push you into somewhere where he has trapped, which requires a little luck, then he gets a lot more. So give and take, but that's how I feel about Trapper. I love him to death. There should be more penalty for snapping traps, and maybe he should start with all of them in his hand. I don't know why not, Next up, we have Michael Myers. Michael Myers, ironically, one of the biggest names in this game, is at their base level just an abysmally unfun killer to play. You start off at tier 1, and there's tier 2 and tier 3. In tier 1, you have no terror radius, which is neat. But you have no lunge. It's incredibly hard to hit survivors. You move a little bit slower. It's unbearable. So you have to find survivors and just stare at them and stalk them to tier 2. And once you're at tier 2, you have a small terror radius. I believe it's 16 meters. You have a normal lunge. You have a normal movement speed. You're normal. Cool. In that way, you're this sort of semi-stealth killer. You're not really a stealth killer, but you're kind of a stealth killer, right? But you can never go back to tier 1. You can never go back to being fully stealthy, which is weird and maybe worth looking at. But then once you stalk survivors more by standing and staring at them, you get to tier 3. And in tier 3, you vault a little bit faster and you have a slightly modified lunge that can instantly down survivors. The problem with this is you still have to entirely play around pallets. You have to still entirely play around windows. So things like shack window can be an absolute nightmare, making bamboozle almost a requirement for this killer. But tier 3 eventually runs out, and then to get tier 3 back, you have to seed some of the potential hits you can get on survivors to stop and stare at them again. It's a problem because at the end of the day, Michael Myers has to give up a ton of space to stare at people, so much so that he has to 99 tier 3, right? So he has to stalk almost all the way up, then catch up to somebody, and then hopefully find an advantageous location, pop tier 3, and instantly down them. It's a whole lot of effort to do like some bare minimum stuff. It's rough, and I think Michael should definitely be reworked in a lot of ways. Maybe he builds passive tier 3 in some way. Every time he gets stunned, he builds tier 3. Every time a pallet's broken, he gets tier 3. So, something of this nature, so that as you're playing the game naturally in tier 2, you're achieving tier 3 without having to give up all of this room and having to stop what you're doing entirely and all of this. I mean, he's not really even a stealth killer, so I think there needs to be some reevaluation there. It's really, really tough, but I believe he's the bottom of the barrel. He's the hardest to get to work without some of his busted add-ons and without perks like Bamboozle and things like that. So, but what do you guys think? That is the entire tier list. I know this is a lengthier video. Shout out to Otz because he inspired me to kind of do this sort of video. What opinions do you agree with the most? What opinions do you sort of disagree with? And of course, I love you guys. Thank you for being here, and I will be praying to the entity to see you in the next video.